productivity and focus is the best currency we have as entrepreneurs. In this interview, we're going to tap into how you can be more focused, get more done, and really access your own deep work.
Welcome to Thriving Launch with Louise Congdon and Kamala Chambers, the show for heart-centered entrepreneurs who want it all.
5 days a week, we bring you different segments to inspire you to live a life of freedom. We interview the leading experts in the field of business, health, and love. Be sure to check out Training Tuesdays, where we give you a clear action plan to grow your own business.
Do you have a product or service that you would like to sell online? Or maybe you've been thinking about it, but you're reserved to do it because you need a website, you need complicated systems, and you need to spend money? Well, I've created a completely free course that teaches you how to use Facebook in a purely organic way. This means no ads and no money are needed. You can use Facebook completely free. So head on over to thrivinglaunch.com. Opt into my Profit from Social Media course. I'm going to teach you the free methods to using Facebook to make money today. Today's guest is Cal Newport, PhD from MIT and Associate Professor at Georgetown University. He's also an author and the writer of Deep Work, as well as another book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. Cal is going to dive deep with us on how to go into the zone and dive deep. Welcome to Thriving Launch. Calvin, it's awesome to have you here. Are you ready to launch?
Always ready to launch. Thanks for having me on.
So, I know that your work with your book, So Good They Can't Ignore You, was an awesome read. A lot of people really latched onto it. And you've come out with something new about deep work and how we can get more out of life, and how even deep work is something that is even creating a new kind of emotional intelligence. And I'd love to hear more about that from you.
Sure. Well, why don't I'll start by laying the sort of foundations of the topic. So, just to define it, deep work is the activity in which you're giving something intense focus for a long period of time. So it's getting your full attention, you're thinking about it as hard as you can, and for a long period of time with no distraction. So no glances at this, no breaks for that.
That's my absolute favorite type of work.
I'm really hoping I learned something, because I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you can already tell I'm somebody that has a hard time not glancing at my phone every 10 minutes or opening up a new tab or having a different conversation or a phone call and trying to do work. So I'm very interested in what you have to say.
Well, your excitement is well justified, because essentially the premise of my book, and this is not my phrase, this is actually a phrase that came from The Economist talking about the book, is that deep work is like the killer app of the knowledge economy. In other words, this type of effort where you're able to give something intense, unbroken focus is incredibly valuable, and becoming only more valuable at exactly the same time that, as we know, people are actually becoming worse at it. So when I think about deep work, I think about it as this great opportunity that if you cultivate this skill, and it does require cultivation, and if you prioritize this skill, which requires quite a commitment, there's these huge order of magnitude benefits you stand to reap, both in terms of business productivity, but also in terms of just meaning and satisfaction and enjoyment of your professional life. So I'm as excited as you guys are about this concept, because I think it's one of these activities that, if mastered, can really be transformative.
When I can get into those deep work zones, so much gets done. And it's not even just about what I accomplish in the day. It's about the way that it moves through my whole being, because I just feel so in the flow. And I have certain systems or methods that I use to get into that zone, but I'd love to hear from you. How do we access that deep work where we do stay focused for long periods of time?
I feel like you and Calvin are on a date right now, and because I'm so different, I'm like listening and excited to hear what you're going to say. I have such a hard time focusing on one task at a time. So what are some ways we can do that, Calvin?
Yeah, well, there's two things that seem to be almost always necessary to succeed with a deep work session. And so one is having some notion of scheduling, system, or routine. Deep work is difficult. it uses a lot of cognitive energy. So it's something that it's very hard to just spontaneously fall into and just decide, yay, I'm just don't have a lot to do, and I'm in the mood to focus really hard. That doesn't happen very often. So people who succeed with deep work tend to have some sort of scheduling routine, which might be I do deep work at the same time on the same days, or it might be a scheduling discipline. Like every Sunday, I block out on my calendar when my deep work is happening, or it could be more extreme, like the people I chronicled that use this bimodal philosophy of putting aside many days at a time and just falling off the grid. And then coming back and being connected again, and then many days at a side of being off the grid. Whatever it is, having some sort of scheduling system or routine seems to be key. And then you have to couple that with some sort of ritual surrounding how you actually approach to work, where you go, your rules when you do the work, what happens during your working session, what you're not allowed to do, how long you work, this type of structure and ritual around the deep work itself. Those two things combined are sort of a necessary recipe if you're going to succeed at doing a lot of deep work in your life.
Your sharing really reminds me of when I was preparing for my SATs. For me, I don't have a PhD, so I never had to take the GREs or some of those more advanced testings that are very arduous. But one of the things that I studied when I was looking at taking my SAT was that it was a better idea to try to study in the same place in an environment that's similar to where I would actually take the test. And as you're sharing, you're reminding me of that if we want to go into deep levels of work, we want to have a certain type of environment and go back to that place repeatedly. So it's like a certain part of our mind gets triggered. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, so location helps because it essentially allows your mind to initiate the sort of transformation routine into deep work mode in sort of autopilot. So if you know that when I go to this location or I do this to my office or I go for this walk, this means I think deeply, eventually you can slip into your deep work mode for free just by going to that location or initiating that ritual. On the other hand, if you just in an arbitrary location at an arbitrary time, just say, you know what, I'm going to try to wrench my attention away from what I'm doing right now and force it to focus, that's actually going to expend a lot of willpower. And as we know, your willpower reserves really fluctuate throughout the day and through the week, and so that's going to be a much more risky gamble and one that's not going to pay off quite often.
Kamala is really powerful at going into states of really deep work. When she was writing one of her first major books, I remember that she could just work for 10, 12 hours straight. And she did this for days, for more like weeks on end, where she would just go into this deep state. And kind of my job at the time was really to make food for her and bring her stuff so that she could work. I really wanted to support her through this process. Writing a book is such a big accomplishment. And I'm just curious to hear from you, Kamala. What is something that, is environment a part of that for you?
Yeah, well, it could be, maybe this is a different thing than what you're talking about, Calvin, but some things that I find that really help me go in those states are, one is blocking off my schedule, like you're talking about. Two is kind of cutting out the noise. And so I have a specific playlist that I use to help me get in the zone and tap into staying focused because I get distracted by noise. So that's one thing that I do. And then also making sure that I've got the nourishment and the food to stay focused for long periods of time. And I use coffee like a drug because I think it is a drug. And so I will sometimes use coffee to go into those states and use it intentionally for that.
Yep. Well, all of those things come up often. I profiled several people in the book who had their deep work rituals down to the point where it wasn't just where they went, how long they're going to work, what they're going to drink, what they're going to eat, but at the exact times they were going to fill up their second cup of coffee, when they were going to take a break to go to the bathroom even. Some of these people had it so regimented that from the outside, you say, this is crazy. But on the other hand, they were accomplishing a massive amount of stuff because it seems to be a law of true concentration that the more you can take off of your mind's plate and just automate and fix, and it's just there and supporting you and you don't have to worry about it, the more energy you have to actually focus on the task, which means you can actually get to deeper levels of concentration. And it's really worth emphasizing that people underestimate how much better results you can produce and how much more results you can produce when you're really achieving intense levels of concentration. It's not a little bit more productivity. It's more like orders of magnitude more productivity. It's almost like a superpower that those who have really honed this ability to concentrate intensely, it's almost like a superpower, how much they're able to produce per, say, unit of time they actually spend working.
You're reminding me a lot of the interview that we did with Jay Papasan, where he talked about the one thing and trying to reduce your tasks to the very most essential. So even when you have a bunch of tasks or you only have 3 or 4 tasks, taking that to 2 or 1 tasks and ultimately getting to one and then really focusing on that. And that's something that he talked about.
Yeah, and I think there's an important distinction here that supports what he wrote in that book, and then also like Greg McKeown in Essentialism. They both touched on this point of trying to identify the most important things to work on. And from my perspective, an important way to think about this is to recognize that there's really 2 types of work tasks. There's deep work tasks, which are tasks that really do require your full attention. They push your skills to your limit. So it's when you're sitting down to write a chapter of a new book and to produce the best possible writing is just pushing your mind to its limit. And then there's everything else, which I call shallow work. So these are tasks that do not really require your full attention. They don't require you to apply hard-won skills. They're relatively easy to replicate. So, answering emails or doing social media or tweaking your WordPress configuration, these type of things that aren't, I got to give this my full attention is very hard, but kind of necessary things. And the reality is that, shallow work in a job is what prevents you from getting fired in some sense, while deep work are the type of efforts to get you promoted. Or in the entrepreneurial context, shallow work efforts are the type that maybe prevent you from going bankrupt next month, but deep work efforts are the type that double your revenue a few months down the line. And so I think this selection question is also clarified through the lens of deep work, because what it tells you is it's only these deep work efforts, the efforts that require your intense concentration, that are really going to push you forward or push your business forward. And that they're different. It's a different class of effort than shallow work efforts, which is the administrative and logistical minutia. Shallow work has to be done. But, I try to help people foster this mindset where they crave the deep work. And if they're not getting a lot of that done, they feel uncomfortable. And I think we have more and more people in the knowledge economy that are doing essentially 100% shallow work and considering themselves, successful because they, well, I'm busy all the time. I'm always doing things. Shouldn't this count? And so this is sort of a secondary benefit of this terminology, is that it helps you understand that there's some efforts that push your mind to its limit and produce the most value you're capable of producing. And then there's the easy to replicate stuff, and they're not the same thing.
This is really liberating for me to hear you talk about this stuff, because even coming down to the craving of the desire to get into the deep work, that's when I want to get there and I'm, maybe Luis is distracting me with another project or something else is happening in our business, I find myself irritated because I know where I want to get to the most productivity and that sense of flow. Now, what is something else that we can be doing, all of us here, all the thriving launchers, what can we be doing to tap into the deep work?
Well, I think one thing that is important is to measure. And I think one of the most important metrics you can start with is your deep to shallow work ratio. It's a pretty simple idea. You essentially, as you track your time throughout the period of a week, you count how many of your working hours are actually spent in a state of deep work. So giving something unbroken attention for an hour or more at a time, your intense concentration, and how many hours for everything else. And then look at the ratio of those two. And I think this is really informative because it gives you an actual number to not only observe, but to use and manage. It allows you to say things such as, for my current position and goals, my deep to shallow work ratio should be X. And then you can go and measure it. And if you're falling short, you can let that concrete number help push you to make concrete changes to what you let on your radar, how you approach your work, how you run your workday. So I think, what gets measured gets managed. So anyone who's looking to thrive or to get ahead or create things of value should have an answer to those 2 questions. What's my target deep to shallow work ratio, and how close am I to hitting that right now?
That's really great. That's a great tip. I want to share something that the male listeners might not like at all, but
Hey, how
uh,
dare you?
but from a female perspective, my ability to access deep work depends on where I am in my cycle, and I just think that that's something as females. And even if males, like, when are you most productive during the day? Is it the morning or is it the evening? Like, look at your cycles. As a female, like, I'm kind of brain dead around menstruation, and then, like, I can go right into the deep work when I'm ovulating. So I don't know if you ever heard that perspective, but for me, looking at my cycles is a really big important part of when I can go there.
Well, I think this is an emerging area of study and certainly something that people are increasingly recognizing as being important in the world of professional productivity. And that's this notion that we're not computer processors. And you can't just think about, okay, I have a bunch of tasks and I'm a processor and I just have to my only decision is to sequence them and then I just execute them one after another. And to instead recognize, no, we have rhythms, high energy here, low energy here. This type of the month I have higher energy. This part of the day I have higher energy. This part of the week versus this part of the week I have higher energy. And that this notion that work should be uniform at all points between 9 to 5, 5 days a week, 4 weeks a month, that you should be executing the same way, doing the same amount of work at the same level, the same pace. Increasingly, we recognize, just like you're noting, that doesn't make sense. And so, I mean, I think you're onto something really important. Tony Schwartz has done some interesting work on this. Douglas Rushkoff's book, Present Shock, has a really interesting treatment of this as well. And it's something that I hear more and more, that we should not be so homogenous in our work sort of rhythms and energies. It's okay. And I got to tell you, I do this in my own life all the time, and I can get away with it pretty easily because I'm a professor, so I don't have a boss. So I have a lot of flexibility. And what that means for me is that I have huge swings, seasonal, monthly, and weekly, really hard, and then I'm ramped down for a while, or taking days off, and then really hard, and then this month is lighter, this month is really intense. I mean, it's all over the place. And so I think I've had a lot of success with that. I think you're hitting on something important.
That's really great. I'm glad that we dove into that piece because as humans, we do have different seasons and different things that are impacting us. Maybe our children, our partner, work is impacting us in certain ways. So our ability to go deep in different areas changes. You said something interesting about deep work, and you said it's the 60-minute thing. And for me, that's interesting. Or you said, an hour or more. For me, that was interesting because I really got into trying to study effectiveness. And one of the things that I kept finding repeatedly was set a timer for 20 minutes and go deep into that thing and then take a little break and then come back to it. And I've read articles from people like Tim Ferriss, Arnold Schwarzenegger, some very high-level business people where they talk about this 25, 30-minute thing where they go into it. But I'm just curious your opinion on that or what you found through your research.
Right. So that's what I call depth pacing, and it's pretty common. But what's important to recognize about what that actually means is that if you're trying to tackle something that's incredibly cognitive demanding, so you're trying to learn something really hard or produce something of really high value at the very
Like
limit.
if you're trying to write a book, for example.
Like if you're trying to write a book. So things that are at the very limit of your skills, they're too difficult to instigate a flow state, right? I mean, flow states are nice, but flow states are something you hit usually where you're applying like a skill you've already honed in a way that like you're comfortable. So it's a flow
It's kind
state.
of like this groove has already been built in your mind, so you're able to. I'm thinking of like ski jumpers, and I was watching this video where they jump off these big slopes, and they put their skis right into this groove, so that then once they start going down, they're in a groove and they're going fast.
Yeah.
Whereas something new, you don't have that groove.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other analogies is in music. So, if you've mastered a difficult guitar song as a guitar player, when you're performing, you can fall into this flow state because it's this you're applying this hard-won skill at a very high level. It can feel effortless. You get lost in it. But the process of learning that song is really frustrating because you have to keep pushing yourself past where you're comfortable in order to learn the new things, and you're not going to fall into a flow state. In fact, it's going to be uncomfortable as often sort of deliberate practice or learning things deliberately is. And that's where having this depth pacing helps, where you go 20 minutes as hard as I can at this thing that's very uncomfortable and difficult. I'm pushing my fingers a little bit faster than they're able to go right now on this lick. And then you back off for 5, 10 minutes, then back into it 20 minutes. That's important in those scenarios because it's so hard, you can't sustain it. But what's also important to recognize is when you're doing this type of depth pacing, these breaks are of a certain type. So these breaks are not, now let me turn my attention to like email or social media or completely change my cognitive context, because then it's going to be really hard to actually get your attention back to the hard thing you're working on. There's an effect called attention residue, which is really important here. It can take up to 20 minutes for the residue of that new thing you saw to clear out. And until it clears, you're at reduced cognitive capacity. So these breaks that you do, like when you're studying something new or learning a new song or trying to master a new skill, it's more like giving your brain a breather. But it's like you go for a walk around the block or something like that, or go get a glass of water, but you're not context shifting. You're not shifting over to something else and coming back. So that's really important. This type of pacing when you're doing something that's deliberate and very difficult. But it's important when you do these types of pacing blocks that you don't actually completely change your context during your breaks. It's a really sort of passive type of break where you're just letting your neurons essentially cool down.
In some ways, this isn't completely related, and yet somehow my mind is connecting it. In the book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goldman, he talks about a study that was done where people had to do complex math, and then they were asked to solve some other kind of puzzle or rate their happiness. There was something around that, and people scored very badly. Oh, I know what it was. They watched something that was like depressing and sad, and then they had to do math, and they didn't do very well. And then they watched something that made them happy and then did math, and they did a lot better. And somehow that just relates to what you're saying. I know it's not an exact connection, but somehow that just relates to me, because you're forcing people to kind of create this stress and then go over and create this new stress. And it's going to be very challenging to then have a rhythm, because things that are very demanding on us, like you were talking about, that residue, these things that have an emotional residue or a heavy mind kind of like bog, and they take a lot of energy, then it's going to be very hard to shift and then be very effective in either one.
Yeah, I think weightlifting is a good analogy for this effect. So when you actually want to build your muscle, you have to lift something really, really heavy and strain the muscle. And obviously you have to take breaks, right? I mean, you can't keep doing the bicep curls for 20 minutes, right? You lose the ability, you have to take a break. But if you watch people who are doing weightlifting, they don't in between sets, go off and get some work done and watch TV for a little bit. You see that they're in the zone still. They're keeping their mind inside their workout. They're keeping their attention in that general area. They have to really keep their attention on what they're doing. So I think it's kind of similar when you're trying to do a really deliberate type of deep work. You do the intensity, now it's focusing, not weightlifting. Then you back off the intensity, but your head's still in the game. Right? You're still, okay, I'm in weightlifting mode, I'm in the gym, this is where my focus is.
I find that sometimes it'll take me an hour or so trying to get in the mode, or, kind of preparing myself to work up to that mode, but actively working on it until I actually drop in. That's when I'm having a harder time focusing. Do you have any tips on dropping into that mode a little more rapidly?
Right. Well, first we know why it's difficult. Part of that has to do with this effect I mentioned briefly before called attention residue, which essentially tells us that when you switch your attention from one target to another, the original target leaves a residue in your mind that can take a while to clear out. And until it clears out, we know from studies it'll reduce your cognitive capacity. But to talk about it a little bit more informally, those thoughts just kind of stick around. They gunk the works up. And this is really important because even a quick change in attention can generate this residue. And that's why, and not to digress here, but it's just worth emphasizing, that's why it's really important that in a deep work session, there is no distraction. The amount of time you spend the distraction is irrelevant, because even a 10-second glance at an inbox can create a massive amount of attention residue. You see an email there, it's from your boss, you have to answer it, you don't have time to answer it now, and then you immediately turn your attention back to the hard thing you're trying to focus on. That email in your mind, and what am I going to say, and what do you think it is, and how I'm going to write my response, is going to be there for 20, 30 minutes, eating up cognitive capacity, preventing you from achieving true depth. So It takes a while to get started, and if you even glance at a source of distraction, you essentially go back to square one, and it's going to take a long time to clear that residue out. So that's why it's difficult. In terms of helping to get around it, there's the short-term things you can do, which is, you have these scheduling systems and rituals. This is when I do my deep work. For the first 5 minutes of deep work, I do this. I take a walk before I start. I do this to my lights. You have these rituals and timing routines that help your mind know it's deep work time, deep work time, deep work time. That'll help clear out the attention residue a little bit quicker. But also, I do have to emphasize that deep work in general is a very practiced skill. People like to think, I know how to focus, I just need to make more time to do it, but it's more complicated than that. If you haven't been systematically training your ability to concentrate, the amount of concentration you can generate and the comfort you have being in a state of concentration is going to be pretty small. So this is also something that gets better at practice. So people that have to do deep thinking sort of most of their time professionally get really good at this. They can fall into it quicker, they can sustain it longer, they can get to deeper levels of intensity. It's less uncomfortable. So that's the other thing I want to emphasize, is that deep work should be thought about as a skill that you can cultivate, but you really do have to train and cultivate it to get its full benefits.
Calvin, you did something amazing. Luis and we interview some of the top relationship experts in the world as well. And I think this interview has been the most beneficial to our relationship that I've ever heard, because one thing that we do is we work together. So Luis will message me and we'll message each other about different projects we have going on instead of having to get up and go into the other person's space and talk to them. But when I'm trying to go into that deep workspace and I get messages from Luis, it sets me back to square one, and I keep getting distracted. And so I think that just muting Luis altogether when I'm going to those spaces is going to be really good all around.
Well, that brings up an interesting question. Go ahead, Calvin. I have a question to follow up with that around, how do you support somebody and how do you signal to other people that you're going into that space? But I want to let you go ahead with your comments.
Well, I think what I was going to say connects with just where you were going there, because this is kind of the topic I've been working on since this book came out, which is, how do you get these ideas into an actual workplace? And what are the difficulties of getting these ideas? And in general, what's the right way to work in a knowledge economy where the main thing you're doing is producing value with your mind? And there's a lot of different answers to those questions. But in your type of situation, what I was going to suggest is that I'm a huge proponent of synchronous communication. That you can call it office hours, you can call it meeting slots, but in your day, and maybe it's every 2 hours, here's our synchronous conversation times. These are the times where we sit down together and we talk and we deal with everything we need to deal with. And if in between those synchronous slots things come up, you just have to batch them on your end until the next synchronous slot comes up. So you might end up building up a long list of things that you need to ask Luis about, and this and that and this. And then when you get there, you're like, okay, now let's just talk about it all in person, as opposed to asynchronously sort of just sending off as things arise. Oh, I need to know this, or can you tell me about this? There's some good research that has sort of studied this approach to work. What it finds is that at first it's hard because you need things and the next slot for discussion is not for a while and it stalls you. But what the research also shows is that pretty quickly you adapt your work habits so that you learn to get what you need in advance, and you learn to plan out what you're doing a little bit farther, and then people end up being way more productive. So this is my relationship advice.
Oh, right. I love it.
You, is have office hours and don't communicate outside them.
Calvin Newport just saved our relationship. So you talked about focus and deep work being this muscle that you need to exercise. And as you were sharing that, I just imagined what Kamala and I would look like physically if we could make those skill sets predominant as a physical attribute as our muscles. And she looks like a bodybuilder. I look like a shriveled up kind of nerd guy, because she's so exercised and so great in this area of her life. She really knows how to go into a deep workspace. One of the last things I'd like to wrap up with and talk about a little bit is, what are some of the benefits of this, just as kind of thinking about a holistic person? Does this decrease stress? Does this increase happiness? Does this increase output? Does this increase our ability to manage other tasks in life? And just a little thing there too for people that are kind of in the yoga and spirituality world. One of the things that they talk about in Buddhism and yogic tradition is that when you've been a long-term meditator, you go into deep states that are meditation states, and then that allows you to go into what they call single-mindedness focus, which allows you to focus on a task single-mindedly, so nothing else is really present other than the task at hand, and you go into that zone where people have created incredible arts of bodies of work and art and all sorts of contributions to the world because they go into these deep single-minded states.
Yeah, I think this is an important point, and it's actually something that caught me off guard when I was writing the book about this because, originally the first part of the book, which makes the case for deep work, had been outlined to only have the sort of professional arguments. And so why does deep work help you produce so much more? And I went into it. It helps you learn complex things quickly. It helps you produce more per unit spent working because of various neurological effects. And that's what I thought the argument for deep work was going to be. But as I was doing the research, I kept coming up with example after example and resource after resource that kept pushing towards another conclusion, which was deep work also just feels more meaningful. And so I ended up diving into that, and there was all of these different threads of evidence, some threads coming from neuroscience, some threads coming from psychology, some threads coming from philosophy, all of which wove together to produce sort of the same output, which is this idea that deep work just feels better. And you can go into the science of it and the philosophy of it, but really what it comes down to, I think the best way to summarize why this is true is that human beings seem to be wired for craftsmanship. We derive great satisfaction out of putting our resources and applying them at their fullest to produce the best possible things we're capable of producing. And that just feels good to us. It feels right. It touches our soul. It feels meaningful. It feels satisfying. And it's a completely different experience than the sort of typical fragmented attention busyness in which most of us spend our time. And something I learned in doing this book is that we have sort of a whole cohort of people, whole generations of people who are walking around with these low levels of anxiety because we're not really wired to be in this state of continuous partial attention, that instead of creating something of value, we're instead flitting our attention around from this to this and this, and it creates this low level anxiety that we've even don't even identify it anymore as I don't have to feel that way.
I can
And one of the
identify with that. Just to back that up for you is I've noticed, and I've been trying to track that sometimes when I get really wrapped up in having all these different tabs open and multiple projects, I've noticed sometimes at the end of the workday, I feel this kind of anxiety and I don't know why. And so I've been trying to figure out how do I lower some of that anxiety. And one of the things that I've been finding is spending more time with just kind of everything shut off and just kind of like maybe gazing over at nature. One of the ways that a lot of people kind of self-medicate is watching some television program or movie, which in all honesty, I do some of my best deep work there. I'm teasing. I'm just joking because sometimes I can go very long into watching a TV show or a movie. But this is kind of one of the ways that we're self-medicating, is trying to find ways where our attention isn't really anywhere. And what I've been finding is if I can just create a little peace and quiet for a little bit, it alleviates so much of that anxiety, even kind of gets rid of it.
Yeah, and it turns out that if you can put your attention on one thing, you get the same benefits plus others, because you also get the benefit of appreciation and having created something and what the Greeks called, arete, actually putting your talents to their fullest sort of application. So, that's kind of my final pitch for this is there's a lot of productivity benefits to spending more time focusing intensely. But, there's this huge philosophical argument that if you're able to craft for yourself a deep life, which is a life where you focus on a small number of things that you do at an incredibly high level and minimize as much as possible non-deep things, it can not only be a very successful life, but it can also be an incredibly fulfilling life. And, it can be somewhat drastic. Yeah, I embrace these principles, and accordingly, I've never had a social media account. I don't web surf. I don't really know how to entertain myself on the internet. I don't use computers after work hours for the most part. And all this stuff can seem pretty drastic, but it creates this great sort of rich life. I focus on a small number of things and I try to do them really well, and that's very fulfilling, and it's plenty, professionally rewarding as well. So, I'm a big advocate as, a deep life really is a good life.
We've been here with Calvin Newport on the Thriving Launch podcast. It's been so fantastic to have Calvin on the show. I swear this is probably one of my favorite interviews of all time. Thank you so much, Calvin, for coming on and helping us all go deeper in our work.
Well, thank you. I always love the opportunity to go do some impromptu relationship advice. So that's a first for me.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a blast to have you here.
All right, thanks.
You've been listening to the Thriving Launch podcast. For books and resources related to today's episode, make sure to head over to thrivinglaunch.com. We'll see you there.
Kamala and I recently stumbled upon something that's really been helping us have more quality time, increase the quality of our time together. And on this next episode, I want to tell you about how to utilize media and media-free nights to increase intimacy and connection in your relationship.